right, let's, if you want to take your Bibles and go to the book of Exodus, that's where we're going to head eventually. Just a reminder of what we're doing. We're taking a little road trip through the Bible, 66 books, and for the most part, a book a week. I don't intend to ever spend more than a week on a book. There may be some weeks that are small enough that maybe we can get one or two in there. I don't know what I would say for the whole class period on Obadiah, but you know, just read it to you, and there you go. That's it. But poor Obadiah, he's he's going to be like that unrecognized guy in heaven. Everybody's going to walk around going like, "Who are you again?" He's going to need the name tag, and it's going to be embarrassing that most of us are like, "Oh yeah, I didn't read that book," and it's a shame. There's good stuff. We'll get there eventually. But you get some people like Moses who who accomplished quite a bit, and so we're going to look at a second book of Moses today. But just as a reminder, our goal is not to hit every verse, not to hit every highlight. This is, to keep the analogy up, we're kind of driving down the highway looking at these books as we drive by. So they're going to go a little quick. But what I hope happens with each book is that you get enough orientation to it that you go back and you can spend some more time there on your own. I presented a little bit of a challenge to you last week to each week after we cover a book, go back and try to read that book. Break it up by how many chapters per day that you need to get through, and just kind of think of it in terms of this overview that we're saying. What's the purpose of the book? What is it trying to accomplish? What does it contribute to the big story of Scripture? And I think it'll help us as we study our Bibles in general. So as we come to the book of Exodus, we're reminded that we're looking at kind of the second chapter of a 5-chapter book. Moses writes these 5 books, all that are intended to fit together into a single story. And so as we look at these, let me just remind you a couple of things as far as the orientation toward the book. The author of the book, still Moses, so same author, so you're going to see that continuity all the way through. Time of writing. This was, we pointed this out last week, that when you look at all 5 of these books, it's helpful just to remember who the audience was. That he's writing to people, the children of Israel, probably towards the end of the wilderness wanderings. And these are Jews, these are Israelites, these are Hebrews, but they haven't yet gone into the promised land. They've come out of hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt. And so it's you think of these books in terms of what does this group of people need to know about who they are, about where they've come from, and about where they're going. And so as we come to the book of Exodus, I want you to kind of think about where this fits into telling that audience that story. We said last week that one of the goals of Genesis to this audience would be to correct any of that lingering mysticism and religion of Egypt. God explaining himself that he's the creator, explaining the reality of sin in God's creation, explaining to them how they as a people ended up in Egypt. So he tells the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and then Joseph. And so it's all of that background information that they would need to know. But the theme throughout all of that was the promises of God. All the way back in the Garden of Eden, God had promised to send a Redeemer. Then God promised to Abraham, I'm sending you to a land, but you're going to have a seed, and it's through that seed that all the earth is going to be blessed. So we've gotten the first chapter of the book down. Now we come to the book of Exodus, chapter 2 in this story. Just to kind of orient ourselves towards the scope of the book, it's going to pick up where Genesis left off, obviously just continuing the story after the death of Joseph. But within the first few chapters, it's going to quickly summarize a couple of hundred years of history. We'll see the children of Israel being put into slavery by the Egyptians, where they had been sojourning, and eventually coming out of Egypt through a series of miraculous events. And it'll take us this book will take us all the way up to the Israelites standing at the base of Mount Sinai, receiving the law from God. So that's our time covered. So let's jump right into the outline then, and just kind of walk through how does this book progress, what are the sections of the book, and what should we expect from each one of these divisions. And then on one of these in particular, I think we'll park for a little bit to hopefully help us understand what's going on in the bigger story. All right, so we'll start with chapters 1 through 3, where we have getting caught up, as I mentioned, on that Hebrew history. The Genesis had ended with really a kind of a positive situation. They were in Egypt, but Joseph is the second in command of the land. They were given a choice piece of property in the land. They were provided for. They were taken care of. But we read very shortly after that that Joseph dies. The generations began to pass. The children of Israel, there were only 70 of them coming into Egypt, but soon they grow into a vast host of people. But also other things change. You find out some of the dynasties in Egypt begin changing. And you study your world history, and this happens quite frequently. You get some overturn of leadership. So it's the same nation, but different groups come into power, different groups come into control. And the way the Bible phrases it is there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Didn't know all the things that had happened, didn't have the same appreciation for Joseph and his God and for his people. And so eventually this Pharaoh comes to power who sees all of these Hebrews in his land and starts feeling a little bit threatened by it. He realizes, we overthrew a dynasty. Somebody's going to eventually want to overthrow us. And if we're not careful, if these Hebrews join up with them, we're done. So they start coming up with a plan. How can we control this situation? And so in those first few chapters of Exodus, you start seeing some of the plots and plans of the Egyptians trying to control the Hebrews there in the land. And the solution they end up with is to just force them into labor, force them into slavery. We've got weapons, you don't, you now work for us. And so over the period of the next couple of hundred years, the Hebrews find themselves enslaved by the Egyptians. Pharaoh would use things like forced population control, even infanticide, to try to control the population, trying to shut this nation down. And yet God preserves them. In fact, God even prospers them. They continue to grow as a people. And one of those Hebrew babies that was born during this time period ended up even being rescued by an Egyptian princess and being brought into the palace and being raised, although he's a Hebrew, being raised in a sense as an Egyptian. And that's the man that we know of as Moses. So those first three chapters cover quite a bit of territory. We find out Moses, though, in an effort to help his people, ends up killing an Egyptian, has to flee into the wilderness, and spends the next 40 years as a desert shepherd. We come to chapter 4, though, and we find out that this man, Moses, who from his perspective probably feels like quite a bit of a failure. Like, I had such great opportunity, I had such great potential to potentially help and free my people, and no, that didn't work out. And so after 40 years in the wilderness, now as an 80-year-old man, we find him being called by God to go back to Egypt. Moses is sent back to Egypt by God to demand that the Hebrews be released. After a series of plagues and judgments, Pharaoh eventually agrees, and the Hebrews are going to leave the land. Pharaoh, you remember, though, changes his mind shortly after that, starts pursuing after the Hebrews, and traps them at the Red Sea. There's wilderness to the south, there's soldiers behind them, there's a Red Sea in front of them. Oh no, what's going to happen next? Well, it's a pretty intimidating situation, but God shows one of the greatest displays of his power anywhere in Scripture. Literally splits an ocean in half. They cross over on dry ground. As the Hebrews get across on the other side, the waters come back over Pharaoh and his armies, and God's people were freed. As we come to chapter 15, then, we enter into a new section of the book. We've got the story of them coming out of Egypt. Now God takes them intentionally, purposefully, to the base of a mountain called Sinai. Now their journey there, you remember some of the adventures that they have. They're in the wilderness. It's a desert region. There's not food. There's not water. There's, some estimates say, anywhere between 1 and 3 million of these Hebrews. So that's a lot of situation. And yet God provides for them. Even though the people were wont to complain, God would provide with them with water. God would provide them with manna. God would even provide them with quail at some point to give them some food to eat. The point was God was teaching them to trust him, teaching them that he would meet their needs, that he truly was their God. And so when they get to Mount Sinai, what's going to happen there is going to be immensely significant. And this is the section we probably will park on this for a little bit, because even as you look at the outline, this is definitely one of the largest single sections of the book. A lot of attention is devoted to what happens at Sinai. What does God do with these people? Let's look at a couple of passages, look at a couple of verses there. If you're in Exodus, go ahead and turn to Exodus 19. Before we get into the specifics of this promise, I want you to look at some verses that, as God introduces what he's about to do to them, I think these verses here are going to be really kind of the key that unlocks what we're about to read. If you're there in Exodus chapter 19, let's pick it up in verse 3. It says, and Moses went up unto God. And the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, and notice the next word, we'll come back and visit this in a moment, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all the earth, above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Notice how God introduces what he's about to do with them. He's going to set before them a kind of an if-then statement. The computer guys in the room can appreciate those. If this condition is met, then this is the result. This is what's going to happen. God says, you've seen what I've done. I've brought you to myself. I've delivered you from Egypt. I'm taking you to a land. So I have a job description for you. I have a job for you to do. And if you'll obey my covenant, then you get to do this job. And notice what the job is. He says, you get to be a kingdom of priests. The purpose of a priest is to, represent, God to the people and stand between the people and God. He's kind of that go-between. It's the priest that would serve as kind of the representative of God to people. And God says, I want this nation to fulfill that function. Now, they would have some people in the nation that would be designated as priests, but I want you to understand the whole job of the nation. What the Hebrews' function was supposed to be as a group, they would represent God to the world. So it's going to be important that they know who God is, they know what God is like, and that they fulfill the requirements of being God's servants. They're hired to do a job. And so that job has a job description. That job has, here's how I want you to live, here's what I want you to do, here's how I want you to dress, here's how I want you to behave. All of us have job descriptions that have very similar requirements, right? If you're going to do this job, if I'm going to pay you, you're going to, this is the uniform you're going to wear to work. These are the hours you're going to work. Here are the functions you're going to fulfill. Here's the things you're going to do. And if you don't do those things, you're no longer gainfully employed, right? So I want you to think about, to some extent, some of the things of this covenant that God's about to make with them. The requirements that he's about to do is, in a sense, their job description, how they are going to represent God to the world. So what are some of the things that he does? As he goes through this covenant in the next few verses? One of the things that God explains to them is he gives them an understanding of his basic morality. He's gonna say, here are my behavioral expectations. Here's the way you're going to conduct yourself. This is right. This is wrong. Here are my standards. Here are my expectations. So what the law is doing is clarifying for them, helping them to know what they're going to have to do in order to serve God, in order to be his representatives. Now, when you start looking at the specifics of this, as we start going through individual sections, you're going to find a lot of it just simply falls under what we're going to call here universal statements. They're going to be tied directly to the character and the nature of God himself. Because of who God is, well, it just kind of makes sense that this is how you should live in light of that. And because God doesn't change, there's an expectation that these rules don't change either, right? So think about it. God says, I'm the only God that exists. So don't worship other gods. Well, that's true, universally. God's always and ever and only the only God that exists. So it would always be wrong to worship some other God. I mean, he's telling it to them. It's true for them, but that would be true for anybody. When we say, all people, all places, all times. Well, yeah. I mean, that's true. God says, I am the standard of truth, so I don't want you to bear false witness. I don't want you to lie. I don't want you to be dishonest in your communications. I am truth. If you're going to associate with me, you're going to have to tell the truth too. You're going to have to do things that are consistent with my nature and my character. God says, I am life. I've made man in my image, so you don't get to take the lives of other people. And we say it more simply, thou shalt not kill. But there's a reason why you can't do that. It's because of who God is. So it's always going to be true. So when we look through these commands, it does make sense that we see some of the statements that God makes that while we will recognize some of them are made to Israel, we're like, well, yeah, that definitely applies to me. Because of who God is, these things are necessarily true. And even as you just go through where God starts with it, you start going through what we call the 10 Commandments, the first commands God gives. You go through each one of those and say, well, yeah, that's all people, all places, all time, because this is what is true of God. So when we look at the law, we do recognize that a lot of it applies directly. Yes, he's talking to them, but yeah, that makes sense that we apply that to us as well. And I think that part of it is probably easiest for us to grasp. But there's another dynamic in these commands that I think we have to be very careful to pay attention to. And because if we're not careful, we're going to end up misusing and misapplying some of these instructions. So while some of what God commands Israel is true of everyone, we also have to recognize that God is talking to a specific people with a particular purpose at a unique place and at a special time. There are some of these commands that God gives that we have to think about who he's talking to, when he's saying it, and why he's saying those things. So it's all for them, it's kind of all in the same category. But for us, we're going to have to make a few distinctions. We're going to have to recognize as we walk through some of these things that some of these commandments are going to apply to us differently than they did for the nation of Israel. So let's break that down, because I don't want that to be confusing. We think about commands that are given to, first of all, a unique people. Understand that when God gives these law, when God gives these commandments, he is talking to a particular group of people. These are specifically literal, physical descendants of Abraham, beneficiaries and recipients of the specific covenants and promises that God had made with Abraham and with his descendants. And so some of the commands that God gives them are reflective of the fact that they are a unique people in the earth, that they have a unique function. God's taking them to a special land, and God has made particular promises to them that they'll be the ones that bring about the Messiah, and God will protect them and bless them that bless them and curse them that curse them. There were some unique promises that God made to the descendants of Abraham, and some of these commands reflect that. So think about how many of these commands, in a sense, distinguish Israel from every other nation on the earth, because Israel was different than every other nation on the earth. They weren't supposed to be like the Canaanites or the Hittites or the Moabites. These were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they're going to have some unique instructions. So does it make sense that God might tell them, I want you to dress differently than the nations around you. I'm going to give you some clothing restrictions, like, you can have this kind of garment, but not this kind of garment. You can eat this food, but not that food. It's not because food itself is somehow moral or immoral. It's just God says, I'm going to give you a unique diet. I'm going to give you a unique way of dress. I'm going to give you some unique customs. I'm going to have you celebrate some particular holidays that commemorate promises that I've made to you as a unique people. For example, they've just come out of Egypt, that deliverance that God made when he split an ocean in half and took them out of Egypt. God says, you're going to celebrate that every year. You're going to remember that. You're going to celebrate the feast of the Passover from here on out. You've lived here in the wilderness and seen God's protection and God's provision. So there's going to be a feast that you're going to celebrate every year called the Feast of Tabernacles, where you're going to commemorate and remember that God protected you and God provided for you. There are going to be some things, some commands, some instructions in this law that are not, in that sense, universal. You're not disobeying God if you don't celebrate the Feast of the Passover. God didn't bring you out of Egypt. You don't have to, one day out of the year go build a tent in your front yard and camp out. And you might do that for fun. I don't think that's fun, but you might do that for fun. But you're not commanded by God to do it. They were. So as you read through the laws, recognize that some of these instructions are given because they're a unique group of people. And so some of the things that God says to them are, in that sense, for them. Also remember that this is a group that has been called for a special purpose. The passage we just looked at in Exodus 19 God says, look, if you obey these things, this is the job requirement to be my personal representatives to the earth. As I said earlier, just like you following your job description allows you to remain gainfully employed, this is what they're going to have to do if they want to be able to represent God effectively and accurately to the world. They were to act different because they are different. They were to tell the world about God and His promises. So God set them apart because they have a unique purpose. They're not supposed to blend in. They're supposed to stand out. And so as you read through these laws, as you're doing your reading in the book of Exodus this week, look for those things where God clarifies. You can do this. You can't do this. Other nations may do it this way. I want you to do it this way. Other nations may eat this. I want you to only eat this. And notice how God sets them apart. They're a unique people, and they also have a unique purpose. And a lot of their religious requirements that God's going to give them are specifically so that they can draw attention to things about God. That God's going to have them act a certain way and worship a certain way and perform sacrifices and do certain rituals. All of it to draw attention to who God is and what God was like, because that's their job. That's their purposes. So remember that. I don't want to get into too much foreshadowing, but when we get into Leviticus next week and we see, wow, there's a lot of stuff that God asked them to do, a lot of religious requirements that God placed on them. Well, again, remember what this is doing. This is helping them be an effective representation of God to the world. So it's a lot of illustrations, a lot of pictures, a lot of metaphor, if you will. They're doing actual stuff, but it's got a spiritual meaning behind it to communicate to the world their unique purposes. Understand also as you read through the commandments that God gives to Israel, remember also they're living in a very specific place. Some of their laws are going to address the practical realities of living in the wilderness. That's their immediate situation. That's where they are now. And eventually when they get into the land. Remember the context of this. You're kind of building a nation from scratch. This is a group of people that spent hundreds of years in slavery. They've never existed as a nation before. They've never had to have a government. They've never had to have, like official systems and responsibilities. All the things that we kind of take for granted of living in a nation that's been around for several hundred years. None of that exists. So one of the things God has to do is to teach them how to be a nation. As slaves, they never had to have sanitation laws. They never had to be given instruction on what to do when you build a house, how to conduct a murder investigation. I mean, these were just not realities for them before, but they are going to be realities to them, both now in the present and in the future going forward into the land. So God addresses a lot of specific issues, and as you go through, you're like, we feel like, ooh, that statement just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, why do you have to tell people that? Whether it's, God telling them, like I said, I'm not trying to be graphic here, but giving them instructions that, you carry a shovel with you when you go places. Because if nature calls and you've got to take care of business, you can't just do it wherever. You got to dig a hole and cover it up when you're done. I mean, these kind of just very practical necessities that this nation needs to understand. He would tell them things like, when you build a house, put a railing around the roof. Now, that sounds strange to us because most of us don't hang out on our roofs. But for them, getting up on the roof and having an elevation, getting up into the breezes is going to be an attractive thing. That was your living room, was on the roof of the house. So he said, when you do that, build a railing around it so people don't fall off. I mean, these are very unique, very specific situations that are addressing very particular issues in their specific culture. God's writing, in a sense, a constitution for their nation, the body of laws that are going to govern them as a group of people, both in the wilderness and eventually in the land to come. So we've got a unique people, a special purpose, a specific place. And then also remember for a particular time, and this maybe overlaps a little bit with what we've just looked at, but even on a larger scale, some of the laws that God gives them addresses situations and circumstances that you do have to remember He's talking to real people who are going through real situations. He's addressing reality for them. And it may not always address the same situations and scenarios that we face. So, for example, God will give them statements and laws concerning things like slavery, conquest of nations, There's some realities that are addressing specifically the times in which they lived. There's also, though, a larger sense of God giving these laws for a particular time. Let me make an analogy for you. Those of us that have been parents, when you have little kids running around, you got to have a lot of rules. I mean, you just got to have rules for everything, right? Because if you don't have a rule for every situation, something bad is going to happen. So you've got to just think through, and maybe you remember as a parent when your kids were younger, you made rules that you never thought you would have to have. Like, when you were making your wedding vows and you're just looking forward to your life together, you never thought you would have to make a rule one day that says, don't jump on the sofa. I mean, that just wasn't a challenge for you. It wasn't a temptation for you. You didn't think jumping on the sofa was going to be an issue. But at some point in your household, you had to make a law that says, don't jump on the sofa. You have to regulate behavior, especially for young people, because they don't see the consequences of their actions. They don't think long term. Kids live in the immediate. So, imagine this scenario. You're cooking dinner, and you've got the skillet on the stove, the cast iron skillet there, heating up the oil because you're going to fry chicken for supper. And your little 5-year-old comes wandering in, and she goes up and she reaches for that pot. And what do? You slap. No, don't touch. That's hot. And so you say, look, you don't understand that will hurt you. They don't understand why you slapped their hand, why you told them no, but you needed to regulate their behavior because immaturity was going to get them into trouble. But understand what you also hope happens over time. You don't want, your kid coming home from college, walking into the kitchen and going like, ooh, there's a pot on the stove, and running away. I'm not allowed to touch that. You want them to understand, there was a reason why I popped your hand when you were 5, and I'm hoping now you got enough sense to not grab a hot pot. You don't need me to tell you no. You understand why it's a problem to grab a hot pot. You're hoping that maturity eventually internalizes what you had to regulate when they were young and immature. Understand, when you go through the law, there's a lot of times where God is, don't touch that. Don't do that. Don't play with that. And he doesn't go through a lot of explanations. He doesn't give them a whole lot of whys and wherefores. But what's intended with that is that as a person matures, as they learn more about God, as they receive more revelation, as they grow in their faith and their walk with God, eventually these things are supposed to become kind of internalized. If you want to see that, go to the New Testament and listen to Jesus as he preaches the Sermon on the Mount. He'll say, look, the law is not the problem here. I didn't come to get rid of the law. I came to fulfill it. He says, what you guys have done is you've gotten the, don't touch, that's hot. He said, but you haven't grown up in this at all. He says, you've heard it said, don't kill. So you're like, oh, we haven't killed anybody. He said, but did you ever figure out why murder was a problem in the first place? It's because man is made in the image of God. So if you're angry with your brother without cause, you really kind of committed the same thing. He's kind of rebuking them because they never really internalized what the law was supposed to do. He says, you guys sit back and say, well, I haven't committed adultery. He's like, well, okay, but do you understand why adultery was forbidden? It's because there's a sin of lust in your heart. And if you're still lusting, you're committing the same sin. You see what he's doing? He's rebuking them for not internalizing, in a sense, for not growing up. The law wasn't supposed to be, okay, well, as long as we don't kill anybody, as long as we don't commit adultery. Well, yeah, you got to know that, but you're supposed to understand why. And you're supposed to grow. And so in that sense, the law was temporary. It was supposed to regulate behavior until a heart change would come about to make external controls unnecessary. Paul in the New Testament would make a big deal out of the temporary nature of so many of these instructions and these commands. Not just because of the internalization factor, but we will see, especially when we get to Leviticus, so much of this was pictures of what the Messiah would do. A sacrifice that would need to be made in order to atone for sin. Well, once the Messiah arrives, you don't need the sacrifices anymore. And so some of these laws were intended to be temporary. Some of them were only intended to be in effect until the things that they were illustrating, the things that they were picturing came to pass. You remember back from your dating days, many of us had times during our early years where we were separated from our spouses. Linda graduated a year before I did. And so we weren't married yet, but she was in Georgia for the year, and I was still here at school for the year. And so I carried pictures around with her everywhere. Summers when I would work, and I'd be in Louisiana lifeguarding while she was working in Georgia, my lifeguard chain had a picture of her on it, and I carried that picture around with me everywhere. You say, well, you don't have a picture with you today. Well, you're right, because I got the reality in the back of the room. You don't need a picture when you have the reality. And so you think about the laws that we're illustrating and that we're picturing Messiah and Christ, and say, well, why don't we obey those laws today? We don't need to. We have the reality. So again, all of this is to say, I do want you to read carefully the book of Exodus. I do want you to recognize that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, how is it profitable to me? Some of the commands that you're going to see are those universal, listen, everybody needs to do this. You need to not kill people. You need to not commit adultery. You need to tell the truth. And that's always going to be true. But then always ask yourself, but why is it true? And my goal is not just to, hit the bare minimum. My goal is to understand what this law is trying to accomplish and see that goal accomplished. And then recognize that some of the commands aren't going to apply to you because you're not Jewish. You're not living in the wilderness. You're not in the Old Testament times. And you know who Jesus Christ is. You know what those sacrifices and what those laws and regulations were pointing to. So my goal is, as you read through the book of Exodus, now you start knowing how to navigate your way through the book. Look for those universal commands. Look for what those commands pointed to, and reflect on what those commands were pointing them to about Christ and what we reflect on about Christ because of those commands. So you got some categories, maybe some pegs to hang your hat on as you go through it, and that will certainly carry over, especially as we get into next week when we look at the book of Leviticus. So again, some of these, just recognizing that this part of the book is defining morality, explaining standards and expectations. If we understand what to use them for, then we can use them wisely. Second thing that's accomplished in this section of the book, in chapters 20 through 31, is the set of instructions that God gives for designing the tabernacle. So when you get towards the end of this section, it's going into great detail. God is telling them, okay, I want you to build this part of it, and I want you to build this high, and build a box like this, and cover it with this. And very detailed instructions for how to build the tabernacle. A couple of things just to keep in mind with that. One of them, it does illustrate, it reminds us again of the temporary nature of this. God says, I want you to build a tent. That's not a long-term permanent structure, right? Part of this is, you're in the wilderness, you're going to be moving around, and eventually you're going to go into the land. But it's just reminding them, even this location, even this way of worship is to some extent temporary. And so much of it is a lot of symbolism. So many pictures, so many illustrations that God builds into the tabernacle to help them understand things about who He is, about what the Messiah is going to do. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but just think about, God puts a barrier around it. There's a problem. We can't just go to God. There's something that separates us from God. It's a reminder of sin. And if you want to get to God, what do you have to do first? The first piece of furniture that you saw when you went in was the altar. You can't get to God without a sacrifice. A sacrifice has to be made. That sin has to be paid for. Once that sin is paid for, though, the next piece of furniture was a laver. It was water. It was for cleansing, for washing. Then you get, as you get closer to the presence of God, you get the table of bread, picture of fellowship, the candle, picture of God light, God's being light. You got the incense, which is a picture of prayer, the smoke ascending up. You get to the very presence of God, that only one person is qualified to go in there, and he has to have a blood sacrifice to enter into the presence of God. So many illustrations, so many pictures that God is going to use with this tabernacle, so that when Messiah comes, it'll be like, I get it. That makes sense. These illustrations that God was building into how He wanted them to worship Him. So again, as you read the descriptions then of the tabernacle, it's legitimate to ask yourself the question, is there an illustration here? What's the picture that's being painted? How does this help me understand something about God and Messiah? At the same time, though, do let me remind you of this. It's a real structure, so it's got real stuff to it. So don't go too nuts with everything. You don't have to try to find, Jesus under every rock and every, some things are functional, right? God tells them, to build rings to hold the curtains up. Do you know what that pictures? It pictures the curtains falling down if you don't have those rings there to hold it up. So do remember as you read through it. Don't be like, I have no idea what this is a symbol of. It might not be, okay? It might just be that God was telling them how to build a building. And so there's nails and there's tent pegs and, there's rings to hold curtains up. So, stay in the macros there, stay in the big picture there, use some common sense as you read through it, and don't try to read too much into everything. Let's finish out, though, the book of Exodus. After the instructions for the tabernacle, Moses comes down from the mountain. And, even while God is giving the law, even though God had brought them out of Egypt, we find out quickly that it's not so easy to get Egypt out of the people. They had already agreed, yeah, we'll obey you. And 40 days later, hey, we're going to literally build a golden calf and we're going to worship it here in the wilderness. And it's a great reminder for all of us about the frailty of our flesh, how quickly we fall into doing wrong. They had committed to worship God, turned into idolatry and sin. And a fascinating illustration there, they had literally broken their end of the covenant with God. And so what does Moses do? He smashes the tables of stone that God had written his commandments on, broke them because they broke them. But then we see a beautiful picture of restoration. Even though they failed, God's covenant is still intact. God redoes the tables of stone and says, I'm still going to be faithful. You've broken my covenant, but I'm keeping my promises to you. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to restore. As we come to the end of the book of Exodus, we find the construction of the tabernacle. This is, again, the place where they're going to worship God. So much symbolism because they're going to teach the world how to worship God. The symbolism of the tabernacle and the pictures that are there are all going to point them to and point the nations to the Messiah that God was sending. Now, they needed to know a lot of details, though, about how they're going to use this and how they're going to worship, and that's where the book of Leviticus is going to come in that we look at next week. Let me mention to you, though, a couple of takeaways from the book of Exodus, just some quick applications that we can be reminded of as you study this book. The book of Exodus is ultimately a book of deliverance. Quite literally, God has delivered his people from slavery, and he's brought them to himself. It's a great reminder of God's power. And I want you to pay attention to this as we go through the rest of the Bible. Notice how often God's going to refer back to the crossing of the Red Sea throughout the rest of Scripture. It's going to be a continual illustration that he's going to use when he needs to remind his people of his power, of his greatness, of his abilities that go beyond anything in this world can do. The crossing of the Red Sea will be God's greatest display of power, and I remind you, he is no less powerful today. The same God that splits oceans is not going to be overwhelmed by your struggles. I promise there's nothing you're going to face that God cannot handle. So remember the story of Exodus when we face trials. And it also provides a great illustration of our salvation from sin slavery. I mean, this is literally taking them from slavery into freedom, but isn't that what God does with us with salvation? We're bound in our trespasses and sin. We're dead in sin, and yet God, through the sacrifice of Christ, sets us free, brings us to himself. It's a great illustration of that salvation that God's provided for us. Second takeaway that I remind you of is that God has expectations for us as we worship and serve him. I ask you to do me a favor. Take your Bibles and go over to the New Testament. I know we're not there yet. But go over to 1 Peter chapter 2 with me for just a moment. As you read the book of Exodus, you do need to remember that we are not Israel. This book is written to people, specific place, specific time, all those things we've looked at. But I do want to call your attention to something we have in common with Israel, and that is a similar purpose. We said Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests. They were given the responsibility of being God's personal representatives to the world. Their job was to tell the world about the coming Messiah. Well, again, I'm not trying to spoil the rest of the story, but when we get to the Gospels, we're going to find out that when Messiah came, they rejected him. They said, no, thank you. We don't want that Messiah. And well, you can't very well represent a Messiah that you yourself don't accept. So God raises up a new group of people to be his new personal representatives. And as you look at 1 Peter chapter 2, I want you to think about verses 9 and 10. He says, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which have not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. He calls attention to those of us who have trusted Christ. Now, you have the opportunity to represent God to the world. Now, things are different. We're not a single people in a single land. So again, we don't have all of the same kind of rules that Israel had. But we do have a job description, do we not? We've got commands of, love one another, admonish one another, submit to one another. We had a whole series where we walked through some of these expectations that God has for his people today. We have letters that are written to churches and to Christians in the New Testament for us to learn from and for us to learn God's expectations. That's our job description. So those letters become a better description. We're not trying to say, oh, I need to obey all of the rituals of Leviticus. No, I can look at Leviticus and I can learn about God because it's the same God that I have. But my job description is going to be from a different place. So just kind of keep that orientation. God does have expectations for us as we serve him. So learn what you should from the book of Exodus and make sure your applications reflect what God is expecting for you to do today. All right, as we bring that to a close, let me give you one quick announcement and then one update. As far as a church announcement, a Lighthouse Fellowship next Sunday, August 3rd, is our bi-monthly Lighthouse Fellowship. So widows and widowers invited to a potluck lunch and fellowship after the morning service in the Mullinex Fellowship Hall. And you can contact Eric or Tracy Henderson or the church office if you have questions. I also wanted to give you an update on the first responder gifts that we put together last week, and you contributed so generously too. I thank you for that. Let me tell you how that went. If you were here last Sunday, remember we packed 20 boxes, but you also remember the last couple of boxes that we did, we were kind of running low on supplies. So those boxes weren't as full. So what we did was we took those last two boxes and kind of redistributed them. So we ended up with 18 stuffed boxes. And then took those to 3 locations. We took 6 boxes each to the sheriff's office, to the police department, and to the Florida Highway Patrol. And 2 of those we did last year, so they were looking for it. They were ready. When I sent them the email, they responded right away this time. Whereas last year it was kind of like writing to them 3 or 4 times trying to, but they knew what was coming this time. So they were so excited. The Pensacola Police Department, she was saying, yeah, last year we set these boxes up and they just attacked them. They were just like rifling through them and picking out stuff. And then when I called the sheriff's department, Chief Deputy Hobbs is the one that I've been working with. And when I told him, I said, yeah, I got the boxes to bring to you again. He goes, great, I'll let the sheriff know. I'm like, you're going to do what? He's like, yeah, so I'll find a time when the sheriff's available. So when you come down, you can, yeah. So when we went down there, the sheriff and his staff comes down. They were just so excited to get it. And so just appreciated the ECSO. They posted it, the pictures, and the police department did. And then a new group that we took them to this year that we hadn't before was the Florida Highway Patrol. Their situation was kind of like last year's, where I'd written to them and they're like, yeah, whatever. And then when I got there and they saw what was in the boxes, all of a sudden, they're coming out. They're coming to try to help me carry boxes in. They were just so excited. So I just appreciate you guys and your generosity. It's a meaningful gift to them. You see how we ended up doing the boxes. There were QR codes on the outside for both Campus Church and a link to the Good Question gospel presentation. We put tickets to the men's stakeout on the outside of them and made those available to them as well. So here's what my encouragement to you is. Start thinking about next year. You can even now start looking for sales and deals and things. If you're going to buy something now, just pay attention to the expiration dates. It needs to go through December of 26 is what we're looking for. And a lot of prepackaged foods. I don't know if it's good or bad. Definitely meets that requirement. But let me also tell you this. I think we may try to simplify this next year by doing like kind of like we do with the Micah's Pantry, where we kind of create a wish list on Amazon of items. We want to make sure that we get certain items for all the boxes. So just keep that in mind. So you kind of saw what we did this year. So if you want to start picking stuff up on your own, but as we get closer to it, we'll give you some more information about getting some of those items to make sure that all the boxes have. We want to make sure there's a lot of meals in there, individual meals. I'm going to send out a survey to all of these departments later and say, hey, what do you wish was in the box? And so we'll get a better feel for what they're actually using. I don't want to give them things that they end up, nobody likes that and we don't want to use it. We want things that are going to be helpful to them. So just be praying about that, and in the days and months ahead, we'll give you some more information. But I just, again, wanted to thank you specifically for the work that you put into it, for the money that you provided, for the food that you brought. I think we will probably not know right now, but eventually maybe the Lord will let us know the fruit of the labor that you've put into showing these first responders care and love. It's normally $28 a box. It's $20 a box currently. it's the hydration packets. Yeah. So those are. All right. Thank you guys. See you back here next week.